Elon Musk silences Jimmy Kimmel on live TV, the moment that stunned Hollywood. As the cameras rolled and the stage lights bathed the studio in a warm, artificial glow, the band struck up a jazzy intro. Jimmy Kimmel leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly as he studied his guest for the night. Across from him sat Elon Musk, calm and poised, his fingers loosely clasped in his lap. The crowd had settled the air thick with anticipation, knowing this wouldn't be just another celebrity interview. Elon Kimmel began, his tone dripping with casual mischief. "You're the man who wants to take us to Mars, build brain-computer interfaces, and turn cars into robots. Do you ever wake up and think, maybe I'm just a little weird?" Musk's lips curled into a slight smile. Weirdness is often a side effect of trying to change the world. Kimmel chuckled, leaning in as if sharing a secret. Right. But come on, you have to admit your whole life sounds like a sci-fi script written by a guy who just binged a season of Black Mirror. You've got rockets, robots, and now you're raising a kid with a name that looks like a Wi-Fi password. How does that even work? The audience erupted into laughter, the sound rolling over the stage like a wave. Musk remained unflinching, his face a mask of polite amusement, his fingers lightly intertwined in his lap. "Well," Musk replied, his voice steady, "I like to push boundaries. It's part of the job." Kimmel smirked, sensing the audience's energy. "Pushing boundaries, is that what you call it? I mean, look, I've read about your childhood in South Africa. You were this quiet, awkward kid who got bullied a lot, right? You must have had a pretty lonely lunch table." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, the kind that carried a sharp edge. Musk's eyes flicked briefly toward the camera, his expression unchanging, his posture unshaken. "I wouldn't say lonely," Musk said, his tone measured. "I just had different interests." "Different, yeah," Kimmel shot back quickly, his grin widening. "Different like building your own video game at 12 and reading more science fiction than most kids read comic books. That's not just different, that's full-on future supervillain levels of different." The crowd laughed again, the band striking up a quick, playful tune to underscore the jab. Musk's expression remained neutral, though his eyes held a sharper glint now. "I think being different is a good thing," Musk countered, his voice still calm but with a hint of steel. "Most of the people who've changed the world didn't fit in." Kimmel leaned back, pretending to consider this. "Sure, but then you go and name your kid XAA12. That's not just breaking the mold, that's smashing it with a sledgehammer. How do you even say that? Do you call him for dinner with a math equation?" The audience erupted again, some clapping, others whistling. Musk's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a sign only the keenest eyes would catch. "It's pronounced X-Ash," Musk replied, his tone clipped, "and he's a wonderful kid." Kimmel pounced, his grin widening. "Oh, I'm sure he's a genius, probably building his first rocket as we speak." "But come on, Elon, be honest. Isn't it a bit weird to have a child whose name even your Tesla autopilot would struggle to pronounce?" "Nah." Musk leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Kimmel's. His hands remained loosely clasped, but there was a new sharpness to his gaze, a flicker of intensity. "My son will grow up knowing his name stands for something unique, something meaningful. I'd rather that than just another John or Mike." The audience murmured, the air in the studio shifting slightly as the tension deepened. Kimmel caught the change, hesitating for just a fraction of a second before pushing further. "And your wife," he added, his tone light but with a sharp edge. "Grimes, she's a little out there too, right? I mean, I've seen some of her music videos. That's not exactly small-town PTA meeting material." The crowd chuckled, though the laughter was tinged with uncertainty now. Musk's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening just enough to send a subtle signal that the tone of the conversation was shifting. "Grimes is one of the most creative, talented people I know," Musk replied, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "And I'd appreciate it if you left my family out of this." The air thickened, the bandleader's fingers hovering nervously over the keyboard, sensing the sudden drop in temperature. Kimmel's smile faltered for the first time, his eyes flicking briefly to the side, where his producer was making urgent gestures. "Oh, come on," Kimmel said, trying to recover his tone forced. "I'm just messing around. I thought you, of all people, would get the joke." Musk's gaze remained locked, unblinking. "I do," he said, his voice low but firm. "But I've also learned that sometimes what starts as a joke ends up revealing a lot more than you intended." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut the audience, now fully aware that they were witnessing something more than just late night banter. "Shall we get back to the future, Jimmy?" Musk said, leaning back his eyes, never leaving Kimmel's. "Or do you want to keep digging this hole?" The band struck up a nervous, disjointed riff, the director's hand hovering over the commercial break button. As the cameras returned from the first commercial break, the tension in the studio had subtly shifted. The audience, still buzzing from the sharp exchanges earlier, leaned in, sensing that the interview had only just begun to heat up. Kimmel adjusted his tie, his smile tight, eyes sharp, as he prepared to push further. "All right," Kimmel said, his tone a touch lighter, his grin returning. "We're back with the one and only Elon Musk, the man who wakes up every morning and thinks, how can I make the world a little weirder today?" The audience chuckled, the band striking a playful note. Musk leaned back, his fingers still loosely clasped, his expression composed. "I prefer to think of it as making the world more interesting," Musk replied, his voice steady. "Normal is boring." Kimmel leaned forward, seizing on the moment. "Right, but isn't that a bit convenient? I mean, it's easy to be different when you've got billions in the bank and a private jet waiting to take you anywhere you want. Most people don't have the luxury of being weird." Musk's eyes flicked to the audience, then back to Kimmel, his jaw tightening slightly. "It's not about luxury. It's about vision. I didn't start with billions. I started with a lot of late nights code and a willingness to take risks." "Risks?" Kimmel echoed, leaning back, his grin widening. "Yeah, but not everyone can afford to take the kind of risks you do. I mean, come on, Elon, you once said you were living on $1 a day in college just to see if you could do it. Most people don't have the option to play at being poor." Musk's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening subtly. "It wasn't about playing. It was about testing my limits, seeing what I was capable of." Kimmel pounced, leaning in. "But that's the thing, right? You're different. You always have been. I read about your childhood. You were that kid sitting alone at lunch building rockets in your head while the other kids were trading baseball cards. That's not just different. That's borderline strange." The crowd chuckled, the band striking up another quick, playful riff. Musk's jaw tightened a fraction more, his eyes locking onto Kimmel's, his voice dropping a degree. "Being different isn't a flaw. It's a prerequisite for changing the world." Kimmel leaned back, his grin widening. "Right? But come on, you've got to admit you're not exactly the picture of normal. You've got a kid with a name that sounds like a Wi-Fi password. You're trying to put chips in people's brains, and you want to colonize Mars. That's not just different. That's straight up sci-fi villain territory." The audience erupted again, a few scattered claps echoing through the studio. Musk's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, his posture stiffening slightly. "I'd rather be the guy pushing the limits of what's possible than the guy sitting on the sidelines making jokes." Kimmel's grin flickered, his eyes narrowing as he sensed the tension deepening. He leaned forward, his tone dropping to a more serious note. "But at what cost, Elon? I mean, you're talking about rewiring humanity's future, but you've got to admit you've left a lot of chaos in your wake. You fire thousands of people without warning, you make decisions that send entire industries into a panic, and you name your kid something even your autopilot would struggle to pronounce." Musk leaned forward, his fingers slowly unclasping, his eyes locked onto Kimmel's, his voice dropping to a lower, more dangerous tone. "I make decisions that challenge the status quo. Sometimes that makes people uncomfortable. I'm okay with that." The audience fell silent, the band leader's fingers hovering uncertainly over the keys, sensing the shift in the room. Kimmel hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the side, catching his producer's frantic hand signals just out of frame. "All right," Kimmel said, his voice a touch softer, his grin tightening, "but don't you think there's a line between being a visionary and just being reckless? At some point, don't you have to ask yourself if you're pushing too far?" Musk's eyes didn't waver. His jaw set, his voice sharp. "I'd rather push too far than not push at all." The audience murmured a few scattered claps, breaking the tension for a moment before the silence returned heavier than before. Kimmel leaned back, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against his chair's armrest, his grin slipping as he realized he might have finally hit a nerve. "All right," Kimmel said, forcing a chuckle, his tone a touch forced. "Let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with more from the man who thinks the future should be just a little bit stranger." The cameras cut to a wide shot as the stage lights dimmed the band, striking up a nervous, disjointed riff. The audience remained silent, their eyes locked on the two figures on stage, their breaths held, the unspoken question lingering in the air. As the cameras came back from the second commercial break, the studio felt different. The audience leaned forward, eyes wide, breaths held. The band struck a quick, nervous tune before falling silent, their unease reflecting the simmering tension on stage. "Welcome back," Kimmel said, his voice a touch too bright, his eyes not quite meeting Musk's. "We're here with Elon Musk, the man who might just be the real-life Tony Stark if Tony Stark also had a Twitter addiction." The crowd chuckled, though the laughter felt thinner, more hesitant than before. Musk's expression remained composed, his eyes steady on Kimmel fingers still lightly intertwined in his lap. "So, Elon," Kimmel continued, leaning in slightly, his tone sharpening, "you've got your hands in a lot of pies, cars, rockets, satellites, brain chips. But let's talk about Twitter for a second. Or should I say X? What's the end game here? Are you trying to turn it into some kind of digital empire too?" Musk's eyes glinted, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been the shadow of a grin. "X is a platform for free speech, a place for ideas to spread without being filtered through the biases of traditional media." Kimmel leaned back, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against his chair's armrest. "Right. But you've been criticized for how you've handled it. The mass layoffs, the sudden policy changes banning journalists. Some people say you've turned it into a digital Wild West." Musk's gaze didn't waver. "Sometimes you have to break a few things to build something better." "Break a few things," Kimmel echoed, his tone sharpening. "That's a pretty mild way to describe firing half your workforce and letting conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. Are you really building something better or just breaking things to prove you can?" Musk's jaw tightened slightly, his fingers interlocking a bit more firmly. "Change is disruptive by nature. If you're not upsetting some people, you're probably not pushing hard enough." Kimmel leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "But at what cost? I mean, you're talking about free speech, but you're also one of the richest, most powerful people on the planet. You're not exactly the underdog here, Elon. How do you reconcile that?" A flicker of annoyance crossed Musk's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "I'm not claiming to be an underdog. I'm trying to build platforms where ideas can thrive, even if that makes some people uncomfortable." Kimmel smirked, leaning back in his chair, his eyes glinting with the confidence of someone who felt he had the upper hand. "But isn't that the problem? You say you want free speech, but it seems like the only voices you're amplifying are the ones that already have power. Doesn't that kind of defeat the purpose?" Musk's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression hardening. "Free speech isn't about comfort, Jimmy. It's about letting people say what they think, even if it makes others uncomfortable." The audience murmured, a few scattered claps echoing through the studio. Kimmel's eyes flicked to the side, catching his producer's frantic hand signals just out of frame. He ignored them, leaning in even further. "Okay, but don't you think there's a line between free speech and just giving a megaphone to chaos? At some point, don't you have to take responsibility for the platforms you've built?" Musk leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Kimmel's. "I take responsibility for building platforms that challenge the status quo. That's the whole point. If you're not challenging the narrative, you're just part of the echo chamber." The air in the studio thickened, the band leader's fingers hovering nervously over the keys, unsure whether to play a tune to break the tension or let it simmer. Kimmel leaned back, his grin fading slightly as he realized Musk wasn't flinching. "All right," Kimmel said, his voice a touch quieter, his tone losing some of its sharpness. "But don't you worry that one day you'll push too far, that you'll cross a line you can't come back from." Musk's eyes didn't leave Kimmel's. "I'd rather cross a line than stand still." Kimmel hesitated, his jaw tightening for the briefest moment. He forced a laugh, glancing at the audience, but the room remained still. The air tensed, the band leader's fingers frozen over the keys. "You know," Kimmel added, leaning in, his eyes locked onto Musk, "there's a difference between being a visionary and being a villain. Are you sure you know which one you're becoming?" Musk's jaw tightened, his gaze narrowing, but he remained silent, the air around him seeming to hum with a quiet, simmering energy. The silence that followed was thick, the air in the studio humming with unspoken tension as the camera lights flickered, signaling yet another commercial break. As the cameras rolled back from another commercial break, the studio felt tenser than ever. The band struck a few tentative notes before falling silent, their unease mirrored in the faces of the audience members who leaned forward, eyes wide, breaths held. Kimmel forced a grin, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the armrest. All right, Kimmel said, his tone a touch sharper, his eyes narrowing slightly. We're back with Elon Musk, the man who wants to build the future, even if it means breaking a few things along the way. Musk's lips twitched a hint of a smile, though his eyes remained cold. Breaking things is sometimes necessary to rebuild better. Kimmel leaned in, his voice dropping a notch. Sure, but at what cost? You talk about free speech and disruption, but you've been accused of stifling dissent and silencing critics. Isn't that a bit hypocritical? The crowd murmured, the tension thickening as Musk's jaw tightened slightly. Free speech doesn't mean speech without consequence. It means the right to speak your mind, even if it upsets people. Kimmel's grin returned sharper this time, his eyes glinting with a hint of something meaner. Right? But isn't it convenient that the people you seem to favor are the ones who already have power? You've got a platform, you've got influence, you can shape narratives. Isn't that just another kind of control? Musk leaned forward, his fingers tightening, his voice dropping to a lower, more dangerous tone. I'm not trying to control narratives, Jimmy. I'm trying to break them. The audience's murmurs grew louder, a few scattered claps echoing through the studio. Kimmel leaned back, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, but he pushed on, unwilling to let the moment slip. All right, he said, his tone sharpening, but don't you think there's a difference between disrupting the status quo and just being a bully? You're not exactly the little guy anymore. You're the richest man in the world. You can afford to lose a few battles, but what about the people who don't have your resources? What about the people you put out of work? Musk's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening, his voice coming out cool and measured. Progress isn't always comfortable. Disruption means some things will break, but that's the price of moving forward. Kimmel leaned in, his grin widening as he sensed an opening. But at what cost, Elon? At what cost? You keep talking about changing the world. But what if the world doesn't want to be changed? What if you're just building another empire, another system that benefits the few at the expense of the many? Musk's fingers tightened, his eyes locking onto Kimmel's. Empires rise and fall. I'm not building an empire. I'm building a future. The room fell silent, the audience holding its breath as the two men locked eyes, the tension crackling like static in the air. Kimmel's grin faded slightly, his fingers tightening on the armrest of his chair as he realized he had perhaps pushed a step too far. You know, Kimmel said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a lower, more pointed tone, there's a fine line between being a disruptor and just being a chaos agent. At some point, you've got to ask yourself if you're really making the world a better place or just breaking it because you can. Musk's eyes flicked slightly, a sign that the words had hit their mark, but his voice remained steady. I'd rather break the mold than live inside someone else's. Kimmel chuckled, though it was a sharp, brittle sound, his fingers tapping nervously against the armrest. All right, but what if you're the one who needs to be disrupted, Elon? What if the world decides it's had enough of billionaire saviors who think they know what's best for everyone else? Musk leaned back, his jaw tightening slightly, his eyes narrowing as he considered the words. If that day comes, I'll adapt. That's the difference between me and the systems I'm trying to disrupt. The studio fell into a tense silence, the band leader hesitating, fingers hovering over the keys, unsure whether to play a tune or let the moment hang. Kimmel forced a smile, glancing nervously at the audience, but the room remained on edge, the air thick with anticipation. We'll see, Kimmel said, his tone a touch softer, the sharpness fading as he realized he had perhaps pushed too hard. We'll see. The cameras cut to a wide shot as the stage lights dimmed for another commercial break, the band striking up a nervous, disjointed riff. The audience remained silent, their eyes locked on the two figures on stage, their breaths held, the unspoken question lingering in the air. As the cameras returned from yet another commercial break, the tension in the studio had reached a simmering peak. The band struck a few tentative notes before falling silent, their uncertainty mirrored in the faces of the audience members who leaned forward, eyes wide, breaths held. All right, Kimmel said, forcing a chuckle, his fingers still drumming nervously against the armrest. We're back with Elon Musk, the man who, if we're being honest, probably has the most chaotic group chat in history. The audience chuckled. Though the laughter was tinged with nervousness, the tension in the room still thick. Musk remained motionless, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed firmly on Kimmel. Elon? Kimmel continued, leaning in slightly, his tone sharp, but with a forced edge of humor. You've talked a lot about free speech disruption and building a better future. But let's be real for a second. You've faced a lot of backlash. Some people say you're out of control, that you're a chaos agent, a disruptor without a conscience. Do you ever worry that one day you'll push too far? Musk's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening slightly. I don't worry about that. The world needs disruption. It needs people willing to push boundaries, to break molds. Kimmel leaned back, his fingers still tapping his smile tight. But at what cost, Elon? You talk about the future, but what about the present? What about the people who get caught in the crossfire of your disruption? Musk's gaze didn't waver, his voice low and even. Progress has a price, it always has, but the alternative is stagnation. Stagnation, Kimmel repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism, or stability. Maybe some people just want a little stability. Maybe they're tired of billionaires playing God with their lives. Musk's eyes narrowed further, his fingers tightening around each other, the faintest hint of a scowl darkening his features. I'm not playing God, Jimmy. I'm trying to ensure humanity has a future. The audience murmured a few scattered claps, breaking the tension for a moment before the silence returned heavier than before. Kimmel leaned forward, his tone sharp. But what if you're wrong? What if all this disruption, all this chaos just leads to a world that's even more broken than the one you're trying to fix? Musk's jaw tightened, his eyes locking onto Kimmel's, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. If that happens, then I'll own it. But at least I'll have tried. Can you say the same, Jimmy? The silence that followed was absolute. The studio audience frozen, the band leader's hands hovering uncertainly over the keys, the cameras catching every flicker of tension, every tightening of jaw and narrowing of eyes. Kimmel hesitated, his grin fading, his eyes flicking nervously to the side, his fingers tightening on the armrest of his chair. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension, the audience holding its breath, the band silent, the cameras rolling. You know, Elon, Kimmel said, his voice dropping to a lower, more pointed tone, you've got a kid with a name that sounds like a Wi-Fi password, a company that wants to put chips in our brains, and you spend your days talking about colonizing Mars. At some point, you've got to admit, you're not exactly the relatable everyman hero. Musk leaned in his eyes, locking onto Kimmel's. His fingers slowly unclasped, his voice dropping to a calm, razor-sharp tone. I never claimed to be an everyman, Jimmy. I'm here to build the future, not fit into a mold. The studio fell into a tense silence, the band leader's fingers hovering uncertainly over the keys, unsure whether to play a tune or let the moment hang. Kimmel forced a smile, glancing nervously at the audience, but the room remained on edge, the air thick with anticipation. We'll see, Kimmel said, his tone a touch softer, the sharpness fading as he realized he had perhaps pushed too hard. We'll see. The cameras cut to a wide shot as the stage lights dimmed for another commercial break, the band striking up a nervous, disjointed riff. The audience remained silent, their eyes locked on the two figures on stage, their breaths held, the unspoken question lingering in the air. As the cameras returned from the final commercial break, the air in the studio electric, the tension so thick it seemed to hum beneath the bright stage lights. The band struck a few uncertain notes before falling silent, the audience leaning in breaths, held eyes wide, unsure whether they were witnessing a train wreck or a moment of televised history. All right, Kimmel said, his voice tighter than before, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the armrest. We're back with Elon Musk, the man who wants to take us to Mars, put chips in our brains, and let's be honest, probably tweet from the moon one day. The audience chuckled, though the sound was more strained than before, their nerves clearly fraying as the tension in the room continued to rise. Musk remained motionless, his eyes locked onto Kimmel, his expression unreadable. Elon Kimmel continued, leaning in slightly, his tone sharper, his smile tighter. We've talked a lot about disruption tonight, about chaos, about breaking molds, about pushing boundaries. But I have to ask, what happens when the world decides it's had enough of your kind of disruption? What happens when you push too far? Musk's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening, his fingers intertwining more tightly. If that day comes, then I'll adapt. I always have. That's the difference between me and the systems I'm trying to disrupt. The audience murmured a few scattered claps, breaking the tension for a moment before the silence returned heavier than before. Kimmel leaned back, his grin slipping, his eyes flicking to the side, catching his producer's frantic hand signals just out of frame. "All right," Kimmel said, his tone softening slightly, his fingers still tapping nervously against the armrest. "But what about the people you've left behind? The workers you've laid off, the communities you've disrupted, the lives you've changed in ways they never asked for." Musk's gaze didn't waver, his voice low and even. "Change is hard. Progress is messy. But doing nothing is worse." Kimmel leaned in, his grin returning sharper this time, his eyes glinting with a hint of something meaner. "But what if you're wrong, Elon? What if all this disruption, all this chaos just leads to a world that's even more broken than the one you're trying to fix?" Musk's jaw tightened, his eyes locking onto Kimmel's, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension. "If that happens, then I'll own it, but at least I'll have tried." "Can you say the same, Jimmy?" The silence that followed was absolute, the studio audience frozen, the band leader's hands hovering uncertainly over the keys, the cameras catching every flicker of tension, every tightening of jaw and narrowing of eyes. Kimmel hesitated, his grin fading, his eyes flicking nervously to the side, his fingers tightening on the armrest of his chair. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other, the air between them crackling with unspoken tension, the audience holding its breath, the band silent, the cameras rolling. Musk leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, controlled tone that cut through the silence like a blade. "You know, Jimmy, the world doesn't change because people sit around worrying about what might go wrong. It changes because a few people are willing to take risks to push forward, even when others cling to the past." The studio fell silent, the weight of Musk's words settling over the audience like a heavy blanket. Kimmel's grin had fully faded now, his eyes wide, his fingers frozen against the armrest of his chair. "You asked me if I'm worried about going too far?" Musk continued, his voice unwavering. "But what worries me more is doing nothing, of sitting still while the world burns, while the clock ticks down on our only planet. I'd rather be the guy who tried too hard than the guy who never tried at all." The audience erupted into hesitant applause, the tension breaking for a moment as Musk leaned back, his gaze still locked on Kimmel's. The band struck up a hesitant, disjointed tune, their fingers fumbling over the keys as the energy in the room shifted, the balance of power tipping subtly but unmistakably. Kimmel forced a tight smile, his jaw clenching, his fingers tapping nervously against the armrest. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in his throat, the moment slipping away as Musk leaned back, his eyes still sharp, his posture unyielding. "Well," Kimmel said, finally, his voice tight, his eyes narrowed, "we'll see." The cameras cut to a wide shot as the stage lights dimmed, the band striking up a nervous, disjointed riff. The audience remained silent, their eyes locked on the two figures on stage, their breaths held, the unspoken question lingering in the air. As the final credits began to roll, the camera caught one last shot of Musk, his face a study in calm intensity, his eyes locked forward, unblinking. The band struck the final chord, the stage lights dimming one by one, leaving only the faint hum of the studio lights as the final echoes of the clash faded into silence.